The first time I saw him, every person in that boardroom found something else to look at. Not because he wasn't commanding, he was. Broad shoulders, sharp jaw, a presence that filled a room before he even spoke. But Nolan Graves rolled into the Harrington Capital conference room in a wheelchair, and suddenly the most powerful investors in Boston became very interested in their phones, their coffee cups, the view of the Charles River through the floor-to-ceiling glass. Anywhere but him. I noticed because I was the one who had to hold the door open. My name is Spencer Reed, and at 26, I was the youngest associate at Harrington Capital Partners, which is a polite way of saying I was the one who arrived at 6 in the morning to set up the chairs, brew the coffee, and leave at 9 at night after throwing away the cold leftovers from dinners I didn't get to eat. I had been chasing this job for 3 years. My mother worked double shifts as a home health aide in Worcester for most of my childhood so I could go to college, so I could wear a blazer that didn't come from a thrift store, so I could stand in rooms like this one and belong. The student loans were staggering. The pressure was constant. But I was there. I had made it inside. The annual Harrington Impact Summit was the firm's signature event. 2 days of panels, networking, and charitable pledges that collectively moved more money than most small countries saw in a quarter. Nolan Graves was the key guest. At 34, he had built GraveTech Solutions from a 2-person startup in a Summerall apartment into a defense logistics company worth somewhere north of $400 million. His father, Raymond Graves, was the kind of Boston name that got buildings at universities named after him. Old money, old connections, old expectations. Nolan had exceeded all of them, and then 18 months ago, a drunk driver had run a red light on Route 9 outside Wellesley, and the crash had taken the use of his legs. The whispers started the moment he came through the door. Not mean, not openly. That's not how it works in rooms full of well-educated, well-mannered people who have read enough LinkedIn posts about inclusion to know the right things to say. It was subtler than cruelty. It was avoidance, a slight shift in body language. A conversation that suddenly became very absorbing. People who had been eager to shake his hand 2 years ago now found excuses to be on the other side of the room. I watched it happen in real time while I arranged the last of the breakfast pastries on the credenza. My supervisor, Catherine Lowe, caught my eye from across the room and tilted her head in the direction of the podium as if to remind me, "Don't stand around, keep moving." I grabbed an empty tray and started toward the kitchen. I don't know what made me stop. Maybe it was the way he sat. Not slumped, not defeated. Nolan Graves sat the way a man sits when he has spent a long time deciding how he is going to sit. Deliberately straight, hands resting easy on the wheels, chin level. He was watching the room with an expression I recognized from somewhere deep and personal. It wasn't anger. It wasn't bitterness. It was patience with a fraying edge, the patience of someone who has learned to wait for other people to remember that he is still in the room. The person who had been assigned to greet him, a senior associate named Preston, who had been practically vibrating with excitement about this introduction for 2 weeks, was now somehow engaged in a conversation with a hedge fund manager near the window. The introduction had simply not happened, and Nolan Graves sat 15 feet from the center of the room, completely alone, with a glass of water no one had offered him sitting untouched on the table nearby. I set the tray down. I told myself I was just going to refill his water. That was a reasonable professional thing for a junior associate to do. I picked up the pitcher from the credenza and walked across the room. When I reached him, I poured water into his glass, and then I did something I had not planned to do. I pulled out the chair next to him, sat down so that we were at the same eye level, and I extended my hand. "Spencer Reed," I said, "I'm glad you're here today." He looked at me for a moment, not suspicious exactly, but careful. The look of a man who has learned to read the difference between genuine and performative very quickly. Then he shook my hand. His grip was firm, certain. "Nolan," he said. And that might be the first time in 6 months someone said that to me at one of these things and meant it. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything for a second. Then I asked him how the drive-in had been. He said traffic on the Mass Pike was still inexplicably terrible at 8 in the morning, which it always is, and I laughed because it was true, and then we were just 2 people talking about Boston traffic, which is the great equalizer of this city. The room noticed. I felt it without looking. A shift in attention. A few glances in our direction. Catherine's eyes found me from across the room, and her expression was one I couldn't fully read. Concern, maybe. Or something else. I didn't move. We kept talking. He asked me what I did at Harrington. I told him honestly that I was junior enough to be setting up chairs and senior enough to pretend I wasn't. He smiled at that. A real one, the kind that rearranges a person's face. "You're the first honest person I've spoken to at one of these events in a long time," he said. I told him that probably said something unflattering about finance as an industry. He laughed, a real laugh. 2 minutes later, Preston materialized at my elbow, suddenly available, suddenly remembering his responsibility to greet the keynote speaker. I stood, introduced Nolan to Preston, shook Nolan's hand again, and picked up my empty tray. The world of the summit resumed around me like nothing had happened. But something had. I just didn't know what yet. I spent the rest of the morning running AV cables and managing the registration table. When Nolan took the stage for his keynote, I stood in the back of the room near the sound equipment because there were no extra seats and someone needed to monitor the microphone levels anyway. He spoke for 45 minutes without notes. He talked about building GraveTech, about the early years when he and his co-founder, a woman named Petra, had lived on instant ramen and 18-hour days in an apartment where the heat didn't always work in January. He talked about what it meant to build infrastructure for the people who protect others, the logistics systems, the supply chains, the unglamorous operational frameworks that made the missions of first responders possible. He was sharp, specific, funny in places. He told the room that the defense industry was full of people who wanted to talk about heroism and very few who wanted to talk about the trucks that carried the supplies. He was the trucks and supplies guy, he said, always had been. And then, near the end, he paused. He said that 18 months ago everything changed for him. He said he was not going to stand, and then he stopped and something crossed his face, and he said, "Wrong verb. Sorry, I'm still getting there." A few people in the audience shifted uncomfortably. He waited them out. Then he said he was not going to pretend that the last 18 months had been easy, or that he was the same person he had been before the accident. He said he had spent a year rebuilding his body, his company's leadership structure, his understanding of what rooms were and were not accessible, and why that mattered in ways he had never once thought about before. He said the most isolating thing about the year had not been the physical recovery. It had been walking into rooms, his word, and he let the word sit there, and watching people decide not to see him. The room was very quiet. He said the most human thing anyone had done for him in a very long time was something that had happened that morning. Not stood over him with good intentions and a slightly too wide smile. Just sat down. Same level. Normal conversation. He didn't look at me. He didn't name me. But Catherine Lowe did look at me from 3 rows ahead, and her expression had changed completely from what it had been that morning. After the keynote, the room erupted in applause that felt a few degrees more genuine than the polished clapping that usually closes out these things. Nolan was surrounded immediately, and this time the crowd moved toward him rather than away. I watched from the back of the room and thought that maybe something small had cracked open. I didn't expect anything to come of it. Junior associates at firms like Harrington do not get remembered by keynote speakers. That is not how the industry works. I was wrong. The following Tuesday, Catherine called me into her office. She shut the door, which she had never done before in any conversation we'd had. My first thought was that I had made some procedural error at the summit. Wrong chair configuration, mismanaged the AV, something. I ran through the weekend in my head trying to identify the mistake. She sat behind her desk and folded her hands and looked at me for a moment before she spoke. She said that Nolan Graves had reached out to the firm. Not about an investment opportunity, not about a speaking engagement. He had asked about me specifically. He had asked who I was, what my role at the firm was, and whether I might be open to a conversation. I said I didn't understand. Catherine said that GraveTech had recently decided to formalize their corporate foundation. The Graves Foundation for Operational Resilience focused on veteran rehabilitation and first responder self-support programs. Nolan was looking for someone to help build and run it. Someone who understood institutional finance well enough to manage the funding structure and cared enough about people to make the human side real. He had mentioned, she said carefully, that most people in his world had one of those qualities. He hadn't met many who seemed to have both. I was quiet for a long moment. Catherine said she was not going to pretend this was a typical opportunity. It would mean leaving Harrington. It would be a departure from the traditional finance track I had been working toward. She said she personally would be sorry to lose me, but that she wanted to be honest. The kind of work Nolan was describing didn't come along often. and she would not be doing me any favors by dressing it up as anything other than a genuine choice. I thought about my mother working doubles in Worcester so I could be in rooms like this one. I thought about why I had wanted to be in rooms like this one in the first place. I had told myself it was security, stability, the loans, and all of that was true. But sitting there in Catherine's office on a Tuesday afternoon in March, I realized I had been confusing the room with the reason. I asked if I could have a few days to think about it. Catherine said of course. I took one. Meeting Nolan at his office in Back Bay 2 days later felt different from the summit. There was no stage, no audience, no pitcher of water to justify my approach. We sat across from each other at a table in a conference room that had been thoughtfully renovated. Adjustable height surfaces, no threshold at the door, open space rather than the cramped setup I was used to. He had clearly rebuilt his physical environment with the same systematic attention he brought to everything else. He asked me directly why I had sat down that morning at the summit. I told him the truth. I said I had watched the room do what rooms do, and I had recognized something in his expression that I didn't want to leave alone. I said I grew up with a mother who worked in home health care my whole childhood, who came home every night smelling like antiseptic, and told me stories about her patients that made them real people rather than cases. I said I had spent my adult life trying to build the kind of security she never had, and somewhere in the process, I had started to forget what she had actually taught me about how to be in a room with another human being. Nolan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that was probably the most honest thing anyone had told him in a job conversation in his professional life, including people who had been explicitly hired to be honest with him. I asked about the foundation. He had thought through the structure carefully. Seed funding from Gravetech's philanthropic budget, with the long-term goal of endowment independence within 5 years. The focus would be two-pronged. First, accessibility retrofit grants for veteran rehabilitation centers, and first responder training facilities across New England, because he had spent a year in those facilities and has understood how many of them were not actually accessible to the people they served. Second, direct family support programming, emergency financial assistance for the families of first responders injured in the line of duty, because the injured person got the headline and the family absorbed the actual long-term cost. The longer he talked, the more I understood that this was not a vanity foundation. This was a man who had spent 18 months learning, from the inside, what the gaps actually were. I said yes before I left the building. The first year was not clean or triumphant. It was spreadsheets and grant applications, conference calls with facility directors, who had been doing things the same way for 30 years and were not immediately convinced that a 26-year-old with a finance background understood their constraints. It was site visits to rehabilitation centers in Providence and Portland and Burlington, where I saw, firsthand, what Nolan meant about accessibility. Buildings that had a ramp at the front entrance and nowhere else, bathrooms that technically met code and were practically unusable, therapy rooms that had been designed for a patient population that was assumed to be ambulatory. Nolan came on those site visits more often than I expected. He didn't have to. He was the CEO of a $400 million company. He sat in those facilities and talked to the people running them the same way he'd talked to me at the summit. Direct, specific, no performance of goodwill. They responded to him the way I had. He had credibility they didn't expect, and he used it quietly. The Foundation's first grant cycle released funding to 9 facilities across New England. Nolan and I were both at the announcement event in Springfield, a mid-sized veterans center that had been trying to fund a new physical therapy wing for 6 years. The director, a retired Army colonel named Franklin, who shook both our hands with both of his, told us the wing would be named in honor of a female medic who had died in service, whose family had been involved in the facility's fundraising for years. We stood in the unfinished wing, bare concrete, plastic sheeting, studs visible, and Nolan put his hand on the concrete block wall and was quiet for a moment. I stood next to him and didn't say anything. You learn when to let a moment be a moment. The second year was different from the first. The work had found its rhythm, which meant I started to see the places where it could grow. The family support program was reaching fewer families than it should have, because we were dependent on hospitals to refer them to us, and hospitals were inconsistent. I proposed a direct outreach model, partnering with fire departments and EMS agencies rather than waiting downstream. Nolan looked at the proposal for a long time, asked good questions, pushed back on 2 points where my assumptions were shaggier than I'd thought, and then said to build it. The partnership model launched in 8 Massachusetts cities. By the end of the second year, the foundation had provided emergency assistance to 63 families, mortgage relief, childcare costs, gap income during recovery, for amounts that ranged from a few $100s to over $30,000. Each one documented in a case file that I kept meticulous, and each one representing an actual family that had not had to choose between their rent and their medical bills in a month that was already the worst month of their lives. I was at my desk reviewing fourth quarter reports on a December evening when Nolan stopped by the office. He did this occasionally, unannounced, the kind of thing that had seemed surprising at first and now felt like part of his style. He looked at my screen for a moment. 63 families. He didn't say anything about the number. He said he had something he wanted to show me. He pulled up a photograph on his phone. A woman, maybe 40, standing in front of a house with 2 kids beside her, a boy of maybe 12 and a girl a bit younger. She was smiling in the way people smile when they are not performing a smile. Behind her was a house that looked like someone was taking care of it again, flower boxes under the windows, a new front door painted red. He said her name was Patricia. Her husband had been a firefighter in Lowell, injured on a structure fire. She had almost lost the house. The foundation's assistance had covered 4 months of mortgage payments, while the disability insurance sorted itself out. She had sent a letter to the foundation's office. He had been holding on to the photograph from the letter for 2 weeks, trying to figure out when the right moment was to show me. I looked at the photograph for a long time. I thought about my mother. I thought about the years she had held things together on shifts that started before I was awake and ended after I was asleep. I thought about how many times she had been the person standing between a family and the worst version of their situation, and how rarely anyone had handed her a photograph. I told Nolan that. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he thought that was probably the reason this was working, not because of the grant structure or the partner model or the endowment projections. Because of that, there were harder months. Saw online, grave text fill-in cynical treatment, a wealthy CEO rebranding his image after an accident, the calculation behind the compassion. Nolan read those pieces. I watched him read them once. At his desk, and the stillness in his face was not peace. It was the practiced discipline of a man who has learned not to give criticism more weight than it deserves, and not quite as little as it would like. He said to me afterward that the only answer to that kind of thing was the work itself. The number at the end of the year, the letter from Patricia, the new wing in Springfield. You cannot argue your way to credibility. You build it, I agreed. I also thought privately that it mattered that he was out there. Not behind a press release, not filtered through a communications team, but present. In those facilities, at those events, rolling through doors that had been designed without him in mind and making note of every single one. We returned to the Harrington Impact Summit the following spring. This time Nolan was on a panel rather than the keynote, and I attended as a representative of the Graves Foundation rather than as a junior associate managing AV cables. I wore the same blazer, actually, I noticed. During the reception afterward, I watched something happen that I would not have predicted that first morning. 3 different attendees, a senior partner from a real estate firm, a woman who ran a venture capital fund, and a retired federal judge who had been making the philanthropic rounds for 20 years, all approached Nolan without hesitation. Real conversations, the kind that start with a question and don't have an exit strategy. The room did not turn away. Nolan caught my eye across the reception at one point and gave me a look I had learned to read. Quiet acknowledgement, the kind that doesn't need language. Late in the evening, when most of the room had shifted toward the bar and the noise level had climbed enough that I could step back from it, Nolan came to where I was standing by the window looking out at the river. The lights of Cambridge were reflecting off the water the way they always do in April, which is to say imperfectly and beautifully. He said he wanted to tell me something he had not said directly, even though he suspected I knew it. He said that morning at the summit when I had sat down, he had nearly not come to the event at all. He had spent 3 days going back and forth about it. His assistant had rescheduled twice. His father had called to encourage him, and the call had made it worse somehow. The weight of expectation dressed up as support. He had arrived at the Harrington building that morning, telling himself he would get through the keynote and leave and probably decline future invitations for a while, and then someone sat down. Not to network. Not to position themselves. Just sat down and talked about traffic on the Mass Pike, and in 30 seconds had made him feel like himself again rather than like an occasion. He said he had thought a lot about why something that small could matter that much. His conclusion was that it wasn't small. The decision to cross a room or to pull out a chair, when every other person in the room has quietly decided not to, that's not a minor social nicety. That's a choice about what you believe other people are worth, and people can feel that. Even when nothing is said about it, they feel it. I didn't say anything for a moment. The river moved below us in the dark. Then I told him something I had not said out loud before. I told him that my mother was the person who had taught me that, without ever putting it in those words. She had cared for people at the most reduced moments of their lives, ill, frightened, dependent in ways that stripped the usual armor away, and she had treated every single one of them as though their dignity was not in question. As though being helped was not the same as being diminished. She had done this on a salary that required 2 jobs to approximate a livable income, in a field that gets very little of the recognition it deserves, and a very large amount of the emotional labor. I said I had spent years trying to get into rooms that I thought would make up for what she had sacrificed, and I was grateful for those rooms. But I thought the thing she had actually been trying to give me wasn't the room itself, it was the reason to be in it. Nolan looked at me for a long moment, then he said quietly that he thought I had figured that out earlier than most people do. We stood there for a while watching the river. There is a photograph on the wall of the Graves Foundation office in Back Bay. It's the one Nolan showed me on his phone that December evening. Patricia, her son, her daughter, the red front door. The foundation's communications team wanted to use a more professional image for the wall, something shot by a photographer with better lighting and a proper release form. Nolan said no. He said the one from the letter was the right one. I agreed. I think about that photograph on the days when the work is slow, or the funding cycles are difficult, or the systems feel larger than the changes we're making. I think about the 63 families in the second year, and the 112 in the third, and the number we're projecting for the fourth, that I'm not going to state out loud yet because I've learned to be careful about projecting before the work is done. I think about my mother. I called her the night of the Harrington reception and told her where I was working and what we were doing. She asked me to explain the foundation again, slowly, because she wanted to make sure she understood it. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said it sounded like something that mattered. Coming from her, that was everything. I never planned to pull out a chair in a conference room and change the direction of my life. I was just a junior associate trying not to get fired, holding a pitcher of water, watching a room do what rooms do to people who make other people uncomfortable. And something in me refused to be that room. Nolan once told me, this was maybe a year into the foundation's work, during a late night in the office after a difficult board meeting, that he used to think courage was something you had to manufacture, a decision you arrived at after calculation. He said the accident had changed that. He said the most courageous things he had witnessed in his recovery weren't the dramatic ones, they were the quiet ones. The nurse who looked directly at him on the first day when he didn't want anyone to look at him. The physical therapist who told him the truth about his timeline when everyone else was softening it. The friend who called every week and didn't make it a big deal. He said that kind of courage doesn't feel like courage from the inside. It feels like just doing the obvious thing. I think about that a lot. About how the obvious thing is somehow the thing that most people in a room diss not to do. About how much of what we call decency is actually just paying attention when everyone else is pretending not to notice. I'm 28 now. I have health insurance and a salary that is not extravagant but is honest, and my student loans are manageable in a way they were not 2 years ago. My mother works one job now. I made sure of that. And somewhere in a veterans rehabilitation center in Springfield, there's a physical therapy wing named after a woman who gave everything, with a door wide enough to let everyone through. That's the room I wanted to be in,